John is a physician, and perhaps, I would not say to a living soul, of course, but this dead paper and a great relief to my mind, perhaps that is one of the reasons I do not get well faster. You see, he does not believe I am sick, and what can one do? Personally, I disagree with their ideas. The paint and paper look as if a boys' school had used it. It is stripped off, the paper, in great patches all around. I never saw a worse paper in my life. One of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. It is dull enough to confuse the eye and following pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study. And when you follow the lame, uncertain curve for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide. The color is repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow-turning sunlight. I should hate it myself if I had to live in this room long. The wallpaper has a kind of sub-pattern in a different shade, a particularly irritating one, but you can only see it in certain lights, and not clearly then. But in the places where it isn't faded, and where the sun is just so, I can see a strange, provoking, formless sort of figure that seems to sulk about behind that silly and conspicuous front design.
What are you doing out of bed? Come back to bed. It's cold. You're going to get a cold.
I wish you would just take me away.
Trust me. Listen, we only have 3 weeks left in this lease. I promise. I'm a doctor. You have to trust me. If there was anything that could possibly go wrong, I will get you out of here without a doubt. Just trust me. For God's sakes, what are you doing?
I got out in spite of you of Jane. I'm out of the paper.
Welcome to Gothic Talk. We are now welcoming in Mrs. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, author of The Yellow Wallpaper. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I am excited to talk to you about my story.
First off, I wanted to ask how you are doing with recovering from postpartum depression, which was the inspiration for this story, was it not?
I am doing much better now, thank you. Actually, writing this story, yes, loosely based off of what I was going through, was the best therapy I received.
That is great to hear. Now many of us are dying to know what the significance of the woman in the wallpaper really meant.
When I was writing it, I meant for that woman in the wallpaper to be a reflection of the narrator of the story, almost like a doppelganger, a woman who was trapped within the room but was released from her demons with the removal of the wallpaper. Removing the wallpaper was something she wasn't supposed to be doing, but she was doing what made her feel better, and with that defiance she was releasing herself from the control of others.
I think many of us felt that. We just didn't know if you were going in another direction, adding some spiritualism into the story in the end.
No, I could see how some could view it that way because of the dreams the narrator has and the thought of a woman actually being in the wallpaper, but that was not the case.
Another question most readers would like an answer to is whether we are supposed to sympathize with John, the husband, or whether we are supposed to hate him for trying to control the narrator so much.
That is really up to the reader. I think many people will want to make him the villain because of the innate feeling of supporting the helpless woman, especially when they look at the way he speaks to her and dismisses her. But other readers will see she is an unreliable narrator because John knows his wife and knows that she is suffering from this illness, and that in this time he believed this was the way to help her by keeping her in this one room of the summer home. This is where the readers will diverge and start to take the story into their own hands and decide whether he is a hero or villain.
Is there anything you would like to tell us about the story that we haven't talked about?
One last thing I would like to talk about is other women Gothic writers, because we have formed this whole new subgenre within Gothic. Shirley Jackson, Joyce Carol Oates, Flannery O'Connor are all these brilliant women, and together we have formed this whole aspect of Gothic because we write these stories from our own experiences and with a strong female voice. Together we are changing Gothic and adding more to it through our writings, and it is my belief that since our stories are based off of real experiences, that adds a whole new layer to the so-called creepiness of Gothic and is making this genre better because of it.
I would believe most readers do see that when they read this story, but it is great to hear that from you. the author. Our final question for you, Mrs. Gilman, is: how do you perceive your story The Yellow Wallpaper fits into the Gothic genre?
Well, this story in particular has been categorized as female Gothic, which is fine with me since I wanted it to be aimed towards the support of women. But to fit into the Gothic part of the genre, I see that it fits there because of the sense of foreboding that covers the whole story. I wanted it to seem as though you don't always understand what is going on because there is a dark cloud over the story. That is what makes it Gothic in my opinion.
Well, we thank you for spending this time with us, Mrs. Gilman.
When we are parted, I shall go.
To live is die, I will die. To die is life, and you shall live.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am your host, Bram Stoker, and on today's special of the Husbands of Female Gothic Writers, we have the pleasure of interviewing the widower of Elizabeth Stuart Phelps, the infamous author of Since I Died.
Thank you so much. I am so pleased to be here with you all. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you. Now down to business. Is it true that in 1888, shortly after Dr. Harris' death, Phelps married you, a man who was 27 years her junior? However, you all started living separately, and with her heart condition deteriorated and she eventually died alone?
Yes, this is true. My wife believed that marriage was an inescapable fate. If you read her writings, much of them dealt with the constraints, unhappiness, and injustices of marriage. However, just as against marriage life she believed in the possibility for independent single women to live fulfilling and interesting lives. My wife experienced a tough life, in the sense, she experienced a lot growing up, especially with death, so it is no wonder why she would write a compelling story about death. To most people the story may have appeared rather uncanny, but you must understand that she had to create stories like this so that she could understand what was going on around her as things and people were dying. In order for her to literally not go mad, she had to create this life after death to help appease her broken heart.
Do you believe your wife was a witch or a medium? Do you think she had an interest in necromancy?
Absolutely not. My wife was never predicting the future based off information received by the other side. Just like anyone who had to go through life and deal with things, she created a coping mechanism that helped her do so. Rather than turning to drinking or drugs, she wrote and allowed her creativity to be here high.
Do you believe that she was possessed not so much as with a demon that is traditionally seen in Gothic literature, but with the spirit of depression?
Absolutely not. My wife was not depressed. She was simply identifying that death happens to everyone and offering them a better way to look at death. Traditionally death is seen as the old Grim Reapers. However, she was different because she made life look like he was the Grim Reaper and death was hero.
Some people have interpreted that Since I Died was about somnambulism or sleeping walking. Is this true?
No, the lesbian lover actually died. My wife, Dr. Phelps' description of the consciousness of a newly dead person in comparison with the description collected by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross of those who had near-death or out-of-body experience has a remarkable similarities.
What do you think about when excerpt? When first you said I was sinking fast, the words sounded as old and familiar as a nursery tale. I heard you in the hall. The doctor had just left, and you went to mother and took her face in your two arms, and laid your hand across her mouth, as if it were she who had spoken. She cried out and threw up her thin old hands, but you stood as still as eternity. Then I thought again, it is she who dies, I shall live. What do you think this meant?
The ones suffering are merely those who are left behind and have to bear the grief of losing a loved one. However, the one that transitions to glory to be with God in eternity is the one who has life and it more abundantly.
Ladies and gentlemen, the widower of Dr. Elizabeth Stewart Phelps.
All right, everyone, I guess we should just get started. Those pack of fools. Don't they know lottery in June means corned beef heavy soon?
I hope Nancy doesn't get back.
All right, folks, let's get it started.
It isn't fair. It isn't fair.
Hello everyone and thank you for tuning in. Today we are joined by Shirley Jackson, renowned author of various works such as The Lottery, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, and The Haunting of Hill House.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We're excited to have you here. Now, your short story The Lottery has received numerous criticisms since it came out in 1948 and many have found its ending to be very disturbing. In fact, many have cancelled their subscriptions to The New Yorker because of your story. Why do you think so many people were disturbed by the story?
I think that it's because the story revealed a part of human nature that people usually try to ignore exists. I also think it's because of the grotesque implication of the ending that triggered so much disgust and hate. The idea of someone being stoned to death by ordinary-looking people just doesn't sit right for a lot of folk.
You said grotesque implication. What exactly does grotesque mean to you? How would you define it?
Grotesque to me is more about what's implied than what is shown. The human imagination is a unique tool that both helps and hinders us, and I feel that it would mean more if the reader imagined what happened instead of being told what happened.
I've heard that you used to be called a witch and that you practiced witchcraft. Did those rumors ever influence any of your writings? Possibly with Mary Cat from We Have Always Lived in the Castle.
Well, I can assure you that I'm not a witch nor have I ever practiced witchcraft. I do, however, have a fascination with witchcraft and the occult which I portrayed with Mary Cat's own fascination. So, yes, there are influences of the occult throughout my stories such as Mary Cat's own magical practices, and in The Haunting of Hill House there are elements of the supernatural.
Speaking of The Haunting of Hill House, many readers were left wondering whether Eleanor truly was possessed by Hill House or if it was all just in her head. The whole book is one big mystery and we wanted to know if you could shed some light on the matter.
Well, I don't want to spoil anything. The unexplained is a large part of my novel, and I think that the attempts by the readers to solve the mystery of Hill House are a large part of the fun in reading the novel. Whether or not Eleanor is actually possessed or merely sleepwalking is a debate for the readers to have. I think that figuring out whether the supernatural is actually real or not is part of reading the novel.
One last question, would you consider your stories Gothic? What does Gothic mean to you?
Yes, I would consider my stories part of the Gothic genre because of the psychological horror and dark tone. For me, Gothic is the exposing the sides of humanity that most people try to ignore and then exploring these areas in greater detail.
Well, that's all we have time for. Thank you for joining us, Mrs. Jackson. We appreciate having you here.
time since this house has had visitors.
I can tell.
For years it's only been my sister and I. Our fragile state has prevented us from seeking out society.
Madeline, yes. Roderick, you mentioned your illness in your letter. Have you...
It is nothing a physician could cure me of. It's a family disease, of the mind as much as it is of the body. In this house, it's nearly alive. With the death of myself and my darling Madeline, this house will finally be satisfied.
The lady died soon after, and Roderick and I bore our sad burden to the family crypt below the house. We did not speak of it again. She was gone.
Today we have with us the writer behind the story this film is based on, Mr. Edgar Allan Poe. Mr. Poe, what do you think of the fall of the House of Usher being considered such a pillar in the American Gothic genre?
It features the trademarks of the genre, of course, the ancestral curse upon the House of Usher, whether it is in the mind or actually affects. There is the trope of the haunted castle, in this case a haunted house, and the unreliability of our narrator.
But is the narrator really that unreliable? Compared to the murderous narrator of your story, the Black Cat, the unnamed friend of Roderick Usher is a saint.
Or is he? There are some theories out there that there is a duality, a doppelganger effect between Roderick and the narrator, two sides of the same human mind, the sane and the mad.
Is that what you intended to show with these characters? A mirroring effect?
It has a common effect in the genre. Another is Madeline's somnambulism, not quite on par with mesmerism, but featured much more often in the Gothic to add a sense of mystery. Was Madeline fully conscious of her surroundings? Is someone responsible for their actions if they recommitted whilst sleeping?
Okay, so you avoided answering the question of authorial intention. What about the sublime? Where do you think that the sublime features in this story?
The sublime is the beauty of the horror. You as the reader are separated from the events by the wall of reality and fiction. You can experience the awe of poetry, art, and human emotion, and yes, even fear, but you are never in mortal danger. That's the key to the sublime. Seeing a magnificent mountain in the distance is sublime, while falling off of one. The immediate threat to one's life is more the concern than the beauty of what you're witnessing.
On the note of fear and danger, what do you think of this story maintaining more popularity than your Frightening the Pit and the Pendulum?
Pit and the Pendulum builds up suspense, only for the reader to finally be released from it during the final lines of the story. It has a rather linear plot, and while the backdrop for it is the Spanish Inquisition with all of its trappings of ceremonial religion and politics, I could have chosen to place it in any age of brutality. The Inquisition though has a sense of anxiety and angst to it that works very well within the genre. It's not as uniquely American as Brown's novel Wieland, but it works exceptionally well for the Gothic.
That it does. What do you want people to take from your work?
My work focuses on the question of reality and the rational. We do not live in a purely rational world, and if we indeed do, then it is a sense of reason far beyond the comprehension of even our greatest philosophers. Science is there, of course, but it cannot answer for everything. We will never have the full veil lifted, and to rely entirely on our senses in the dense fog of the world's insanity is to drive ourselves into madness.
Well, thank you for joining us, Mr. Poe. We look forward to seeing more from you throughout your undoubtedly long career.